Evo me, hvala šta ste me primili, ugostili i hvala šta ste došli, iako je vruće i početak 9. I umrla je kraljica, ne znam koliko je to vama bitno, ali eto meni bi bar trebalo biti, tako da ako ovo skroz propadne možemo reći da je zbog toga. Sad, Christian Wolff, ako je poznat, uopće je poznat po tome da je pedantan i dosadan. I sad kažu ljudi da su moja izlaganja obično isto tako pedantna i dosadna, sad ja ću se potruditi da ne bude previše dosadno, ali kažem ne mogu ništa garantirati. Sad zašto ja čitam Wolffa, znači ko što je Luka rekao, ja sam sad studij završio na Warwicku i na Warwicku isto niko ne čita Wolffa osim mene, ali na Warwicku se dosta čita Hegel. Specifično čita se Stephen Hulgetov Hegel, on je bio moj mentor za doktorat, koji ima specifično čitanje koje on zove presuppositionless ontology, ili bespretpostavna ontologija. Znači Hegelova logika je bespretpostavna ontologija i ontologiju on razumije kao Seinswissenschaft, kao znanost o bitku. I sad ne znam šta to znači, to za njega znači da je to znanost u nekim osnovnim kategorijama mišljenja i bitka, koje na kraju ispadaju identične, znači thinking and being are one and the same u ovoj interpretaciji. Sad ne znam koliko se ljudi tu bave Hegelom, to je jedna anti-Brandonovska, anti-Pipinovska interpretacija, i to se zapravo mene od malih nogu odgajalo, da se tako Hegel čita, da je to Hegelova logika. I sad, na bazi toga, moj doktorat zvao se The Possibility of Ontology, i ja sam probao interpretirati prijelaz iz Kantove metafizike u Hegelovu kao jedan prijelaz iz nemogućnosti ontologije u mogućnost ontologije. Sad to nije baš ispalo tako kako sam ja planirao i ovaj dio o Wolffu, trebao sam imati samo par tisuća riječi o Wolffu i na kraju je trećina rada ispala o Wolffu i ostatak o Kantu i Hegelu. I bavila se prvo formacijom Wolffove ontologije iz Aristotelove i onda reformacijom Wolffove ontologije u Kantovoj i u Hegelovoj filozofiji. Sad, zaboravio sam reći, slajdovi su na engleskom i ja ću u jednom krenu preći na engleski jer mi je lakše, malo mi je teško na hrvatskom pričat, ali sam mislio da bar ću početi na hrvatskom. Znači, što je Luka rekao, ja se generalno bavim povijesti ontologije, od Wolffa, Kanta i Hegela, povijesti ontološkog dokaza i generalno po novom neapologetskom racionalnom teologijom. Generalno moj historiografski pristup je kontekstualistički, ako vam je to bitno informacija. Sad, ovo je moje, kako bi rekao, debitantno prvo predavanje u kolegama iz Hrvatske i nadam se da neće biti zadnje. I onda što je meni plan bio? Meni je plan bio da prezentiram zapravo u nekim generalnim okvirima to čim se bavim, bez da idemo u neke prevelike detalje. I mislio sam prezentirati nešto što nije toliko poznato, a to je rana povijest ontologije i kao Wolffovu ulogu u toj ranoj povijesti. Znači, moguće je da bez Wolffa termin ontologija se ne bi održao, da je Wolff dosta bitan u povijesti termina ontologije, bez njega možda bi koristili drugi termin, tipa ontozofija ili uopće ne bi imali nešto tako. Ali moja tema danas, znači šta bi ja danas htio reći, je kako se ontologija, o čemu bih htio pričati, kako se ontologija razvila kao filozofska disciplina iz konteksta određenog fundamentalnog problema metafizike. Znači, moja teza danas koju bih nekako htio komunicirati je kako je povijesni ontološki pristup metafizici formirao jednu specifičnu tradiciju. Znači, ontologija, šta je ontologija primarna? Ontologija je pokušaj da se riješe neka stara pitanja, stari problemi u metafizici kao znanosti. I ako je gledamo na taj način, mi možemo vidjeti neke poveznice i neke povijesne putanje koje inače možda ne bi vidjeli. Ok, znači šta ćemo, struktura današnjeg predavanja je, prvo ćemo početi sa kratkom povijesti termina ontologija, onda ću reći nešto o tom problemu metafizike i o Wolffovoj ontologiji kao rješenju tog problema metafizike. Sad malo prije nego što počnem da se reklamiram, a ovo čem danas pričam izaći će slična tema kao članak u knjizi koja izlazi, tako da ako nekog zanima mogu vam poslati draft verziju, samo mi se javite nakon predavanja ili ako vas zanima bilo bi mi jako drago, ali ok. Znači idemo dalje. Ok. Ontologija danas. Znači prije ovog predavanja ja sam mislio, ajde idem pogledat kako je Wolff poznat u Hrvatskoj i čini mi se nije baš, ne čita se baš Wolff u Hrvatskoj. Barbarić u filozofiji racionalizma ima kratak prijevod drugog pogleda diskursus preliminarisa, a Bošnjak u povijesti filozofije ima 8 stranica o Wolffu kao subsekcija Leibnica, znači uvodi u Leibnicu i onda je 8 stranica o Wolffu. To nije čudno, jel? Znači to je zapravo čak i dosta da imamo toliko Wolffa, generalno gledajući, van Njemačke. Međutim, šta bi mene zanimalo, i ne znam odgovor na to, je koliko je Wolff povijesno bio bitan, recimo u 18. stoljeću, u 19. stoljeću, i ne znam, ako neko zna, to bi baš bilo zanimljivo popričat. I jedna stvar koju sam primijetio tako vrlo površnim istraživanjem je da se čini da u Hrvatskoj, da kad se priča o ontologiji, ontologija je dosta bitna, ili bar taj pojam ontologija. I sad, kad recimo, ne znam, ja sam otišao u školsku knjigu pa sam gledao koje su ovi naslovi, ne. A onda, ne znam, sam gledao na filozofskom kolegije, jel? Ima jako puno se spominje ontologija. Recimo, kod nas na Warwicku jako malo se spominje ontologija, od kad smo prestali sa ovim kolegijem Heideggera, nemamo, više niko baš ne priča o ontologiji specifično. I sad sam mislio, ok, kako se tu razumije ontologija, šta ljudi razumiju pod ontologijom, i onda sam odlučio konzultirati Sveto pismo. Jel? Šta je Sveto pismo? Sveto pismo je normalno Kalin, povijest filozofije, jel? Moja kopija iz 2006. I Sveto pismo kaže sljedeće: ontologija je, metafizika se dijeli na ontologiju, kozmologiju, antropologiju i teologiju. Ontologija, opća metafizika, filozofska disciplina o biću kao biću, istražuje ono po čemu su bića, dakle bitak, njegova opća temeljna bitna određenja, a učenje o bitku, valja poneti razliku bića, bit i bitak. Sad, zašto vam to govorim? Znači, meni je ovo zanimljivo jer ovaj način razumijevanja ontologije je dosta wolffijanski. Znači, kad pogledamo kako Wolff razumije ontologiju, ovo u zelenom su stvari s kojima bi se Wolff složio. Ovo u ljubičastom je tako, što bi se Wolff možda mogao složiti, malo da diskutiramo, a u crvenom je, ja mislim da Wolff se ne bi složio, ali dobro. I sad, recimo, historijski me zanima kako je do tog došlo, da je to neki standardna ideja o tome šta je ontologija. I ako usporedimo to sa anglofilozofijom, dobijamo drugčije rezultate. Sad, prije nego što pređemo na engleski terminological note, u engleskom kad ja pričam o biću, ja koristim termin entity. Obično se koristi termin being sa malo b, ali to nekad je teško znati šta je being sa velikim broj, šta je s malim. Znači razlika između bića i bitka. Znači ja za being koristim entity i to je isto prevodim latinski ens, grčki to on. Znači ovo su korelati i ovo su korelati.
Je li ok da komentiramo i postavljamo pitanja u sred predavanja, ćeš raditi na kraju.
Pa ja sam mislio završiti prije nekih 20 minuta, je li to ok?
No, naravno.
Ok, super. Ok, sad, šta se dešava s ontologijom u nekoj anglosferi, jel? Recimo, nalazimo ovo. Ontology is a branch of philosophy, in particular of metaphysics, concerned with questions of existence. Important ontological questions include the following. Are there any such things as abstract objects? Are there any such things as past and future objects? Are there any such things as gods or non-physical souls? So this is from call for papers for a conference on ontology at Central European, while they were still in Budapest in 2015. Now, if Wolff were to read this, unlike when he was reading Kalin, this is what he would do, right? So he would annotate this. Well, now ontology is not about existence, it's about essence. I'm not sure what the objects are that you refer to, but the question isn't, are there any? These are not ontological questions, these are theological questions, these are psychological questions, right? So we can see that this conception of ontology does not resemble a Wolffian conception, and it is one of the kind of, generally adopted, everyone knows conceptions of ontology. Similarly, this is from a CFP for a different conference called The Question of Ontology. The organizers specify varieties of analytic ontology. So what they say is, well, there's different types of ontology. There's a Neo-Quinian ontology, there's Neo-Aristotelian ontology, there's Neo-Salerzian ontology, and there is Neo-Carnapian ontology. Right, so what they're saying is there are all of these different types of ontology, and let's talk about them. Let's have a conference regarding them. Beyond that, there's kind of conceptual ontology in the continental philosophy, Anglo-continental philosophy, which kind of sees it on the basis of Heidegger's understanding. There's also talk about regional ontologies, for example, ontology of mind, ontology of AI, very popular today, ontology of mathematics, social ontology, very popular field today, and there's also ontology in non-philosophical sciences. So basically, I think every science, either social or natural, has an ontology as a subfield in it. I don't really understand what they're supposed to be, but everyone seems to have one. The biggest probably is in information science. They're very keen on their ontologies, on building ontologies. Okay, now, so keeping in mind that the concept of ontology is used in a very, different, in very varied senses today, let's see what Wolff's ontology was supposed to be. Now, Wolff defines ontology in the following way. He says there are some things which are common to all entities, entia omnia communia, and which are predicated both of souls and of natural and artificial bodies. That part of philosophy which treats of an entity in general, the ente in genere, and of the general affections of entities is called ontology or primary philosophy. Thus, ontology of primary philosophy is defined as the science of an entity in general, or insofar it is an entity. Right? So, znanost o biću kao biću, science of entity in general, or insofar it is an entity. So, things to remember are the following. Why is this not? This is empty. Just a second. Okay. Right. So something broke my slides, but okay. So for a couple of things to remember. So firstly, ontology is not, for Wolff, is not the science of what exists, right? So it's not the science of what exists. It's a science of what is common to all entities. So it's not a science of being in some non-trivial sense. Či nije znanost o bitku. It is a science of an entity qua entity. Science of what is common to all entities, what basically means science of those predicates that are common to all entities, predicates or categories that are common to all entities. Now, what I was saying is that I want to present ontology today as a discipline which is formulated in order to attempt to solve a certain problem of metaphysics, right? So to solve a certain problem of metaphysics. Now, a question for the audience. Does anyone know when the term ontology has been formulated? What's the earliest known appearance of the term ontology? Does anyone want to guess? If century or good, almost 17th century. Specifically in 1606. So Jakob Lorchard's Ogdoas Scholastica. This is the first appearance that we know of the term ontology. The second appearance that we know of is Rudolf Goclenius, Lexicon Philosophicum, 1613. They probably knew each other from Marburg, and the idea is that Goclenius takes it from Lorchard. Now, why Lorchard came up with the term, we don't know, right? Why Goclenius liked it and took it, we don't know. The thing is, these are the first appearances that we know, and they're very scarce, right? They don't leave us with much. So, for example, Goclenius, it's a lexicon, it's a philosophical lexicon, and ontologia appears in Greek in a margin. So it's a hapax legomenon, it appears only once in the whole term, in a margin, simply saying like this, ontologia philosophia de ente. Right, it's in the entry on abstraction. Right. Now, Lorchard, basically this is his Ogdoas Scholastica. It's a textbook for teaching 8 Ogdoas sciences, logic, rhetoric, etc. And basically the term appears here, metaphysics seu ontologia. The quote isn't great. So here at the beginning of the entry on metaphysics, so in the title, metaphysics seu ontologia, and at the end, finis ontologia. So that's it. 3 appearances, no explanation, no elaboration, right? That seems to be used as a synonym for metaphysics, right? So basically, these are the first, appearances of the term. Now, the term kind of picks up the steam a bit with Johannes Klauberg, who's a Dutch, is usually presented as a scholastic artisan. So basically, he's a Protestant scholastic scholar who liked Descartes and tried to kind of integrate Descartes within Protestant Schulphilosophie. And he writes one book on ontology, which he calls ontosophy rather than ontology, which gets published in several different editions. And basically, ultimately, the term gets picked up by Wolff. First appearance that I definitely know of is from the 3rd edition of his Logics in 1722, but there might be an earlier one, but I need to check, where he calls it ontologie or the Grundwissenschaft, and then basically the popularization of ontology, or kind of mainstreaming of ontology through Wolff, is basically done through his Latin work, through his Logic from 1728, and through his book Philosophia Prima Sive Ontologia of 1730. Right. So this is usually considered when ontology enters philosophical mainstream, when it stops being just this term which goes through lexica. Okay. Now, when you tell people that basically ontology is an 18th century discipline, they get a bit perplexed. And why do they get perplexed? Well, it's because of this, right? So what we said is that Wolff defines ontology as the science of an entity insofar it is an entity, right? Now, what people are generally aware of is that this investigation is much older than Wolff, right? This is basically Aristotle's book, Gamma, right? Book 4 of the Metaphysics, book Gamma. There is a science which investigates an entity as an entity, theorein, ton, heon, and the attributes which belong to it in itself, right? So when you ask people, when does ontology come about, they think, well, it comes from Aristotle's metaphysics, right, as the science of an entity, quantity. Well, that's in a way correct, but strictly speaking, ontology is a 17th century or 18th century invention, arguably with the idea to solve a certain problem of metaphysics. And this problem of metaphysics, which I keep avoiding, is basically comes from here, comes from Aristotle's metaphysics. Right. So what is this problem? Well, generally, the problem is what is metaphysics, right? So if we want to be very vague, the main problem is what is it? What is the object of it, right? What is metaphysics about, right, as a discipline? Now, historically the problem is quite multifaceted, because on the one hand, it's the question of how to interpret Aristotle's text known as metaphysics, right? So how do we interpret a text by Aristotle, if you know, as metaphysics? And another is, what is this science called metaphysics supposed to do? Now, the confusion seems to lie in what are apparently conflicting accounts of what metaphysics is, right, or of what first philosophy is. So in Metaphysics Gamma, there's the quote that we gave, but there's a different account of what primary philosophy or metaphysics does in Metaphysics 6, so that's Metaphysics Epsilon, which says primary philosophy investigates God as the first principle of everything, as well as divine objects or substances which are separable from matter and immovable or unchangeable. Now, Aristotle calls this science theology, or theologics, theologike techne. And he continues and says that if there were no substance other than natural substance, physics would be first science, primary philosophy, right? But if there is such a thing as something beyond physics, as something which is immovable, separate from matter, then we can talk about primary philosophy. Then we can talk about metaphysics. So, well, what is the problem? The problem is that we seem to have two different objects described by Aristotle in the same work, right? So metaphysics is either this science which investigates an entity in general, an entity qua entity, or it's a science which investigates a certain type of entities, right? Just mathematics investigates certain type of entities, biology investigates certain type of entities. So, it seems that according to book Epsilon, metaphysics investigates certain type of entities. According to book Gamma, there is no specific field of entities which metaphysics investigates. Now this, as you can see from this quote, this is Duns Scotus in Questiones in Metaphysicam. According to Scotus, this question enters Latin scholasticism or Catholic scholasticism through the Arabic tradition. And Scotus says, well, the first question regarding metaphysics is what the proper subject of it is, right? Is it an entity qua entity, as Avicenna claimed, or God and intelligences? Intelligences are angels and, you know, disembodied souls, as Averroes assumed. Okay. Now, that's basically the problem of object, right? So on the basis of this discrepancy with the text, we can ask the question of what is metaphysics supposed to do, right? One question we can ask is hermeneutical. What did Aristotle think? Did he make a mistake? Are these two texts illegitimate, right? Is one of the texts later edition? Is there actually no inconsistency? Or we can ask a theoretical question, right? So is there, you know, what is metaphysics supposed to be? Are we supposed to preference the ontological reading or the theological reading? Now there was an associated problem, which I cannot here call the problem of disciplines, and that is that kind of arose from a kind of historical piling on of terminology, right? So what we know, I believe that we all know this, is that Aristotle did not has never heard of the term metaphysics, right? So metaphysics is not a term that was known to Aristotle. Aristotle called his work proto-philosophia, so first or primary philosophy. Metaphysics is a term which comes later, and there is this third term, theology or theologics, which also kind of is relevant with this issue. And the issue is the following. So basically, Aristotle's, I mean, the question is, how do these two disciplines are supposed to relate, right? How are they supposed to relate? So we know that this is how Aristotle called his work, but after some time there was also this discipline called metaphysics, which was developed, and they developed this discipline called theology, right? And through kind of patristic and I think also Islamic interpretations, theology gets associated not primarily with metaphysics book 6, but with revealed theology, right? With sacred theology, with the science of revealed truth. So basically the question becomes is when reading Aristotle, what purchase does Aristotle metaphysics have on theology, especially on revealed theology, right? Aristotle was a pagan. He said a lot of important things, but from a kind of scriptural perspective, he's wrong on things theological. So the question is how do these two relate, right? So what is the relation between metaphysics, theology, and primary philosophy? And there have been historically attempts to solve these issues, and usually the two issues were solved together, right? So the question of the object and the question of the metaphysical disciplines. And one example I want to show off is Aquinas' attempt, right? So what Aquinas does is he says, well, kind of the solution should be the following. There is only one science which is called theology, right? Or there is one metaphysical science called theology. Theology can be separated into philosophical and scriptural, right? Now, both philosophical and scriptural theology are metaphysical, so they deal with things which are not physical, right? But philosophical theology deals with ens commune, right? And scriptural theology deals with God, right? God as revealed in Scripture. Right? So basically, what Aquinas does is he uses theology as the kind of overall term. Metaphysics also becomes a kind of general term for all types of investigations of things which are beyond physics, which are metaphysical, transphysical, and philosophical theology becomes an investigation into entity qua entity, and scriptural theology becomes an investigation into God. Right? Now, what Aquinas further says is this then becomes primary philosophy, but not primary science, because philosophy of entity qua entity cannot tell us anything about God, because God is not an entity. Right? God is the pure act of being. God is beyond the way of being of entities. So this is, for example, the way Aquinas tries to solve the problem, and this problem kind of tends to persist throughout Latin scholasticism and enters Protestant scholasticism basically through Suarez. After Reformation, especially in Germany, Protestant universities have a problem of basically they don't really know what to teach, right? Because they can't teach the Jesuit curriculum, they can't teach the Catholic curriculum. So the question is, what are you going to teach in philosophy, right? So what they do is they kind of adopt Suarezian approach to metaphysics. And one practice which becomes, or two practices which become adopted in the shift from a kind of scholastic to early modern Protestant philosophy is that the question of proper interpretation of Aristotle becomes less important, right? So the question stops being what did Aristotle think about this issue. It stops being that central. And secondly, this practice of inventing sub-disciplines starts propping up, right? So if we look at Aquinas, basically, Aquinas does not really invent any new discipline. He simply reshuffles Aristotelian, or quasi-Aristotelian disciplines around, right? Similar thing with Suarez and Scotus and these basically Latin Catholic scholastic philosophers. But what starts happening, especially since 1635, so kind of early 17th century, is that people start massively inventing disciplines. So you get disciplines such as pneumatology, angelography, hydrology. Basically, it becomes very fashionable to kind of discover philosophical disciplines, philosophical sub-branches. So within this context of kind of attempt to give a systematic coherency to philosophy, specifically to metaphysics, and to kind of resolve this issue of how does metaphysics relate to revealed theology and, you know, being beyond physics, being about being qua being. This is how I propose we read Wolff's understanding of ontology. So in order to do that, let's have a look at Wolff's philosophy. Now this is a partial architectonic of Wolff's philosophy. So first and foremost, there is ontology as a discipline. So the basic separation of Wolff's philosophical system is there is the discipline of ontology, which is separated into cosmology and pneumatics. Right, cosmology and pneumatics. The names with asterisk are the terms which Wolff invents, or it seems that he invents basically, so which don't predate him, at least not in the same sense. So ontology and pneumatics. Now what is pneumatics? Is it about, you know, types of drills? No, it's not. It's about spirits. It's the science of spirits. So basically it's a common name for psychology and theology, right? So this is the basic Wolffian architectonic. Ontology is the kind of primary discipline separated into cosmology and pneumatics, or cosmology and psychology and theology. Right. Now, collectively, these four or three, how you count, depending how you count, four metaphysics. Right. So metaphysics stops being a discipline in its own right. So we can't really ask the question of what is the object of metaphysics, because metaphysics, it seems to me at least for Wolff, becomes a name for a certain collection of sciences, right? A collection of disciplines. What kind of disciplines? The most abstract possible disciplines, right? So what cosmology is an investigation into most abstract possible investigation into bodies, right? Psychology and theology are most abstract investigations into souls, and ontology is the most abstract investigation into any entity whatsoever, right? It's an investigation of an entity qua entity. Now, this is usually referred to, you will see this very often referred to as traditional metaphysics and separated into general and special metaphysics, right? Now, interestingly enough, Wolff does not use this terminology, right? So Wolff, as far as I know, never uses the terms general and special metaphysics to describe his system. Neither does Baumgarten, neither does Kant. Michaelius does use it, but Michaelius is kind of significantly before Wolff, so I'm not sure where we got this terminology really from, right? So when did we decide that this is a kind of how to present ontology and kind of traditional metaphysics? So you will see this. I think the terms are fine, but it might be worth noting that they are not Wolffian terms. Okay, so besides metaphysics, there are also further sciences, and particularly there's logic, practical philosophy, physics, and teleology, right? I mean, there's much more, but these are just some I would like to point out. And how do these sciences develop? Well, they develop from a certain kind of combination of other sciences. So logic, basically, in order to formulate logic, you first need to kind of undertake ontology and psychology. In order to formulate practical philosophy, you also need ontology and psychology. Physics needs ontology and cosmology, and teleology needs physics plus theology, right? Metaphysical sciences themselves also are in a hierarchical relation. So, as I said, ontology is kind of on top, and from it follows cosmology, and basically psychology, and theology comes as a combination of cosmology and psychology, right? Now, what is this relation supposed to be? This is supposed to be a relation of grounding, right? So this is some form of grounding relation. Now I go into more detail on this in the paper that I mentioned, but basically the idea, usually how Wolff is going to describe this is he's going to say that the later sciences borrow predicates from the previous sciences, right? Now what does that mean? Is basically, for example, physics will concern itself with efficient causation. Right? Efficient causation is a type of causation. Wolff argues that cause is an ontological term. So in order to understand what the cause is, you first need to understand it ontologically. And then you can understand it within physics. You can understand a certain type of causation in physics. Or ontology will tell you that entities can be simple or complex. Right? When you're dealing with psychology, you will be dealing with complex entities or simple entities. Or when you're dealing with cosmology, the same. So basically, a higher science will set up or will elucidate predicates which will be used in further sciences. That's at least one way in which the grounding relation is supposed to function. Now, because there is supposed to be this grounding relation, Wolff says that he calls ontology Grundwissenschaft. Now another reason why he says he calls ontology Grundwissenschaft in German is because he says Dingenlehre sounds very stupid, right? He says, I can't call it Dingenlehre, people will ridicule it, so, you know, Grundwissenschaft is much better term, right? But basically what we have here is we do have a certain solution to the problem of metaphysics. So basically what metaphysics becomes is it becomes a set of discipline, right? And the discipline from Aristotle's book Gamma gets the name ontology. Theology becomes understood specifically as natural theology, right? So when you talk about theology in the system, that's natural theology, that's not revealed theology, which is separate, which is not within the system. And importantly, primary philosophy as a discipline is identified with ontology. So Wolff's title of Wolff's work is primary philosophy or ontology, right? Now, basically, what I would like to do now is I would like to just say something about this identification between ontology and primary philosophy. Now today we might find this, I don't know, somehow intuitive or somehow unproblematic, that in some way ontology is first philosophy, primary philosophy, etc. Now this identification seems to have been very controversial in Wolff's time. Now, how do we know it was controversial? Well, Wolff says that it is, right? So he says, hardly any other name is more despised today than that of ontology, and while it has been pursued with great zeal by the scholastics, it has been despised by Descartes and the moderns. Now, unfortunately, what Wolff does not tell us is he does not tell us where Descartes, you know, spells out this hatred towards ontology, or these moderns who hate ontology, right? He doesn't provide any reference. I didn't manage to find anyone who explicitly disparages ontology. But one thing which can noticed in that with more popular philosophers, the people who we read more often, none of them uses the term, right? So Descartes does not use the term, Spinoza does not use the term, empiricists don't use the term, and Leibniz does not use the term in any published writing or correspondence, right? There are certain notes. I think people have found that the term appears 3 times in his notes, basically. He's kind of playing with it, but he's not really using it. So within the kind of main, you know, big hitters of early modern philosophy, the term does not appear. It seems to be consigned to this different tradition of these Protestant scholastic commentators and lexicon writers who seem to be using it all the time. But with the kind of mainstream people that we read, that doesn't seem to be there. So what I would say is that doesn't just suggest that, you know, people did the thing but didn't use the term, right? That people didn't like the term, so they didn't use it. I mean, there are some people specify how ugly the term is. It's a kind of neo-Greek. But I don't think that's the case. I think that there's more here than just the lack of the term. I think especially when you talk about Descartes, for example, that what seems to be going on, why the term is not used, is because the people that we read more often present us with a very different conception of what philosophy is and of what metaphysics is. So what I want to do is I just want to finish with a kind of little comparison of Wolff to Descartes. And this is Descartes' letter to Mersenne. And he says, I have set my metaphysics to Mr. de Zuchlim. I have not put any title on it, but it seems to me that the most suitable would be René Descartes' Meditation on First Philosophy, because I do not confine my discussion to God and the soul, but deal in general with all the things which can be discovered by philosophizing. Right. Now, basically, one interesting thing which seems to be going on here is that Descartes seems to identify, or at least associate metaphysics with investigation of God and the soul, but first philosophy with the first things which can be discovered by philosophizing. So Descartes does use first philosophy, so does Leibniz, so that seems to be a kind of mainstream term, but ontology doesn't, right? Hence, if I'm right, Wolff's identification of the two would be controversial. Similar. Okay, so I've lost the quote from the Principles. So there's a reference, so you can check it. But okay, I mean it's the similar. I'm not going to read it now. It's a similar point. Okay, so let me slowly finish. So basically, what both Wolff and Descartes agree is that primary philosophy should be understood as a science which investigates first principle of cognition. But when it comes to Descartes, who doesn't use the term ontology, but does use the term primary philosophy, there seems to be no space for science like the science of entities as such. Right? There seems to be no space for ontology within Descartes' system. There's no discipline which is expressly formulated like that. Instead, when Descartes talks about philosophy, he seems to be talking more about this idea of metaphysics, of primary philosophy. So when we talk about metaphysics, we talk about something which is beyond physics, investigations of something beyond physics, which is not really what happens in Wolff, right? As we said, metaphysics is a selection of disciplines, right? It's not defined as being above or above something, at least not in the same sense. So what I'm suggesting then is that maybe we can read Descartes' conception of metaphysics and kind of others in contrast with Wolff's, but in relation to this problem of which reading of Aristotle do you prefer, right? So is it, again, not as a hermeneutical question, but as a metaphysical question. How do you see metaphysics as a science to proceeding? Should it be identified with ontology in metaphysics 4 or with theology in metaphysics 6? Right. Okay, I think I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for attention.